At the heart of Willesden High School, a secret lurks in the shadows. Join us as we uncover the mystery of descendants of witches as Olivia's world falls apart, and the lines between reality and nightmare blur. What is real and what is the work of evil? Let's find out. Here is Descendants of Witches EP13. Thank you for your likes and subscriptions. Hope to see your comments in the comment section. 1. 27 Utah. The lack of light in Willesden had bothered him a lot at first, but now it was normal. The moment the final bell rang, it signaled the end of school, and the start of a long night ahead of them. Although today wasn't like the usual after-school hours. Something about his surroundings was peculiar. The air was thicker. The corridors were emptier. The classrooms were darker. The main difference of all was that it was utterly black. No more grayness. The school was etched in charcoal today, the once gray hues of the hallway no more than a vivid dream. Darkness swallowed him whole as his uncharacteristically grim eyes hid the scared child within. His eyes were not the windows to his soul. They were the void of his being. The black-haired boy solemnly trudged through the grim corridors of Willesden. His gaze was darkly cast on the ground as crimson blood dripped from his clenched right fist. As every menacing second ticked by, a crow screeched in the distance, dying a horrid death because of his conscience. His sunken, raven eyes had a malevolent glint as it scanned the vacant hallway. Shadows danced along the black walls, watching with curiosity as the boy turned the corner. The shadows began harmonizing their vocals, the perfect melody for the ominous atmosphere. Ebony chandeliers dangled from the ceiling, partially dissipating the darkness of the hallways. The rain was silently drizzling outside as the clouded sky turned into twilight, despite it being late afternoon. The only sound that rang through the school was his heavy footfalls pattering against the smeared floor. Even his stomps were heavy with a looming burden. "Boy," the blackness whispered, in a haunting and wispy voice. The shadows on the wall halted their chanting movements and began listening to their intriguing conversation. "My blood covers your sins," it suddenly hissed, its icy breath stinging his skin. The boy paid it no mind and continued walking, but the blackness wasn't finished with his strange talk. "The devil is not evil. The evil one is you," it said in a scorching voice. With a sudden wish, it dissolved into the air. The silhouettes unfroze. They picked up violins and drummed their fingers against piano keys, adding instruments to boost their vocals. He finally reached his destination, room 110. He slumped his aching back against the wall and waited. As he waited, no thoughts flooded his mind. He simply had one objective, one plan. The grand and final scheme before his or someone else's inevitable demise. Perhaps it will be both. Both of their ends today. Whatever the outcome may be, he knew someone will not make it out alive to see dawn break into a new day. He watched the silhouettes dance blissfully across from him, filling the walls with the inky pools of their being. They danced a slow and haunting dance as if they could feel the suspension of the moment and chose to convey it through rhythmic movements. Their pace quickened in synchronization with his thumping heart. They advanced, retreated, pirouette, their arms intensely waving from side to side, their heads swaying like a hurricane. Every move was full of elegant poetry. Their blackness hid their features, yet seemed to show glimpses of flashing eyes from the beyond. Finally, creeping out of the shadowed hall were his friends. After what he had told them, their suspicions of him deepened. It was professional, their relationship. They loved each other but wouldn't hesitate to point a gun at the other's back, especially if it meant one of them was a traitor. There was no use lying to themselves and disbelieving the evidence in front of them. That's what leaders do. They had a goal from the start, and they were not going to let a single friendship stop them from achieving it. He knew and understood, so he told them to give him one chance to prove himself. They obliged because somewhere in the bottom of their hearts they didn't want to believe that their theory was true, for the sake of not being betrayed. So now they were here in front of room 110. The black-haired boy nodded as they each groggily entered the classroom, one by one. He nodded to Jessica, wishing her well for finding her true self. He nodded to Olivia, wishing her well for fighting the unknown darkness that loomed above her. He nodded to Josh, wishing him well for standing up to his mothers. He nodded to Ronald, wishing him well for finally getting first place. He nodded to Barbara, wishing her well for breaking free from her first friend. He nodded to Jimmy, thanking him for his help. He smiled timidly at Carter, assuring him that there was no distance or drifting between them. They closed the door of the classroom behind them, hiding in a place where they would not be seen. The boy remained stranded in the hallway and slumped against the wall once more, waiting. As he waited, he felt like the world was slowly disappearing around him. Or maybe it was just the boy who was fading away. He didn't realize until he was utterly alone that his empty lungs and heart were hammering his chest violently. Suddenly, the blackness returned and hovered in front of him with more to say. The boy looked at the blackness straight in the eye, refusing to utter a word and bend to its will. "Boy," it hissed, sneering at him. "What is your fear?" The boy stared at it solemnly, seeing through its mischievous taunts. "Will you not tell me, boy?" it questioned with a sinister tone. The blackness sighed, irritated by the boy's silent response. "Boy, there is nothing to fear but fear itself. I met fear, so listen. I know if I don't save humans with the wonders of my death, they will die in the horror of life. That is fear, boy. Life." Before the devil could hiss any further, a man emerged from the shadows. The devil that was once blackness to him evaporated, growling with knowingness. The boy craned his neck to meet the man's slightly confused but friendly face. His light brown hair was matted on his forehead. The boy noticed that it sometimes appeared blonde in the sunlight, but there was no light here. The pale-skinned man clutched a dusty green journal, and there was a black rose in the pocket of his collared shirt. The man was someone the boy admired. Part of him wished that his plan would fail, but the other part knew he needed his plan to succeed. "What are you doing here, boy? Do you need something?" the man kindly asked, his glassy green eyes shining at the boy. "Mr. Stevenson," the boy said, bleakly nodding. "You told me the other week that if I needed to talk to you I could," he explained in a gruff voice that was unlike his usual tone. There was barely any light illuminating the hallway, but the half of his face that the boy could see was grinning widely, a little too wide to be human. "Of course. Come in," he said, gesturing towards his classroom. The boy trailed after Mr. Stevenson, his eyes gloomily cast on the ground. When they entered the classroom, his teacher forgot to turn on the lights, or perhaps he didn't care to. Good, the boy thought. It will be easier for them to hide. Darkness surrounded the room like the thick velvet curtains of a theater. The silhouettes of furniture were hardly discernible in this pitch-black night, so the boy jumped and was startled when his teacher suddenly sat at his desk and spoke. "What do you want to talk to me about?" he asked, folding his hands neatly. He had placed his green journal to the side, but the black rose remained in his shirt pocket. The boy turned and slid into the chair that stood across from his desk, at the front of the room. "Mr. Stevenson, I hope you don't mind, but I would like to confide in you about a personal problem," the boy politely said. Mr. Stevenson nodded, urging his student to continue. The boy forced a deep breath, although perhaps there was some truth behind it. Before speaking, he discreetly glimpsed behind his shoulder, eyeing the detention closet that Mr. Stevenson never used. "My father," he slowly began, suddenly realizing how difficult it was for him to say it out loud. It seemed like an easy task in his mind, but now that the moment was here, he had to force the words out of his throat. "Actually, I'll start from the beginning. The real reason why my family moved to Willesden in the first place." Mr. Stevenson gave him a portentous smile, one he assumed told him that he was welcome to say anything he pleased. The boy wished the moon could shine its rays through the window, so he could read his eyes and observe the sincerity of his gesture. The boy hesitantly placed his faith in his teacher, trusting his warm gaze and attentive ears. "Perhaps some good will come out of this," he hoped. "My friends in my old school began punching and teasing me. They just suddenly turned on my back. I don't know why," the boy spilled, biting his lip as the uneasiness of the memory replayed. He spoke in chopped sentences, as holding back tears drained the energy from him. "They beat me, but not as much as my father," the boy said, squinting in the darkness to scrutinize his teacher's reaction. "Oh my," Mr. Stevenson flatly said. There was a silence for a moment, and the boy realized that Mr. Stevenson was waiting for him to speak about the rest of his dilemma. He's willing to hear more. That's good, the boy optimistically thought. Although the fact that his friends were listening in on the conversation humiliated him, so he didn't have the dignity to observe further. The boy swiftly glanced at the closet door, reconfirming. My father beat me every day since I was a young boy. Every morning before school, he would slam my head on the kitchen table. The only thing I could see was my mother calmly stirring the pot at the stove, her back facing me. The boy continued, gripping his hands in an attempt to stop them from trembling. He momentarily forgot his mission, as the horrid memories flooded his mind. He suddenly found comfort in Mr. Stevenson's presence, which encouraged him to continue. He can help me. He truly can help me. So, at the end of last year I decided to tell my principal. I told him about my friends hitting me and my father slapping me. He called a meeting with my parents. At the meeting, my principal told my parents to stop harming me. My father said he learned his lesson and apologized. I was happy. But then, the black-haired boy sighed and looked down at his shoes. After the meeting, I realized I had done something wrong by confiding in my principal. My father began beating me more intensely, blaming me for shaming our family in front of my school principal. My mother just stood by and watched. That's why we suddenly moved, to get away from all the ridicule my parents were receiving. The boy took a deep breath and looked up at Mr. Stevenson. Shadows were cast over his face, but the boy assumed he probably wore a pitiful expression. Is that all? Mr. Stevenson asked inscrutably. My father, still hits me. That's what I want to talk about. He still slams my head against the table every day, and I don't know what to do, he said, swallowing the lump in his throat as those difficult words rolled off his tongue. Is there any way you can help me? The boy asked genuinely. Mr. Stevenson shrugged. I can arrange a parent-teacher meeting now, the boy exclaimed, straightening his back. Please don't, Mr. Stevenson. No matter how many parent conferences we do, it won't change the fact that the next day my father will still hurt me. We'll have to move again. I made so many good friends here and I don't want to leave. The boy cried, choking on his emotional words. His teacher sighed, unsure of what to do. However, that's what the boy assumed. His next words countered that. Are you finished? He suddenly asked dismissively. All hope diminished from his body, although in hindsight there was no hope before. Just a tiny flicker against the wind. With the open eyes of a naive child, he reached out, fingers extended, hoping that Mr. Stevenson was his solution. At that moment Mr. Stevenson had a choice of kindness or cruelty. It took no time at all for him to decide. He saw that dying ember and brought the winds to a cold howl. No, this can't be true, the boy thought, blinking back tears. The first half of his mission had been completed quickly. Too quickly. He told himself that perhaps his cruelty was inflicted unintentionally. He took a deep breath and regained his composure. He swore to himself that he would not stray off track again. The boy swiftly glanced over his shoulder once more, imagining the faces of his friends hidden beneath the coat of blackness. That gave him the courage to continue and find the answers they've been searching for so long. The boy was not doing this just for himself, this was for them too. Mr. Stevenson, there's something else I would like to say, the boy said, his insides hollow. He was decent at hiding his emotions and masking it with normal ones. All it took was clearing his quivering mind and a forcing poker face. I know this will be hard to believe, but please hear me out. Ever since I came to this school, strange things have been happening to me, the boy said, his heart thumping rapidly in his chest. He fiddled with the strings of his sweaters, something he often did when uncomfortable. What strange things? Mr. Stevenson inquired, seeming genuinely interested in the conversation now. That revelation caused an arrow to pierce through his heart. Finding out that his favorite teacher cared about his lies more than his actual problem truly hurt. The boy forcibly swallowed the bile forming in his mouth and continued, setting aside his personal emotions. I'm not entirely sure. I've witnessed haunted classrooms, creepy washrooms, mysterious forces. It's paranormal activity, I think. Ghosts, demons, and shadows have been attacking me. They've been haunting me ever since I arrived here. Call me crazy, but even a triangular mark appeared on my right palm. Mr. Stevenson nodded, and something flashed beneath the surface of his shadowed expression. The boy hurried to investigate the sudden shift, but it was too late. The emotion disappeared before he could identify it. It was like reaching desperately for an escaped balloon, the string dangling so tantalizingly close, but the cruel wind pushed it away. Do you believe me, Mr. Stevenson? Is there anything that can be done, or am I just insane? The boy questioned, his eyes keenly wide. Trepidation swelled through him as his limbs shook with sudden nervousness. This is it. This is the moment when all will be. I believe you, Mr. Stevenson said, leaning forward so that the boy could see the aridity in his green eyes. The boy gulped, bemused. Really? That was quick, he remarked in a skittish tone. He instinctively pressed his back against the chair, slightly relieved. Jimmy said that if he believes me, then he's a victim too. Although there was a hint of uncertainty in his thoughts. Sometimes predictions and theories don't play out perfectly like a script. There are multiple outcomes. I believe what you're saying about paranormal activity occurring at this school, Mr. Stevenson said in an enigmatic tone. But I know you're lying about it happening to you. Inside the detention closet of room 110, the gang exchanged confused glances. Their ears were all pressed against the wooden door, listening intently. The closet could barely hold 7 students, and one flickering light bulb dangled down from the sloped ceiling. However, that did not stop them from carrying out their part of the plan. Carter was sandwiched in between Jessica and Josh, while Jimmy was uncomfortably intertwined with his legs. Ronald and Olivia were at the sides, squishing Jessica and Josh, which caused their bodies to poke Carter in awkward places. Barbara was leaning forward, her ear on the tiny space that was left on the wooden door. She pressed against Josh and Jimmy, which unsurprisingly suffocated Carter in turn. Y'all heard that too, right? Jimmy whispered, unknowingly hoisting Carter's leg up. It was almost comical, their standing situation, although it was not funny to Carter. Carter gasped in response, as quietly as his compressed lungs could muster. It didn't help that Olivia's pungent perfume further suffocated the compact airspace. Mr. Stevenson knows he's lying, Carter managed to add. Josh grunted with disdain. What does that mean? How does Stevenson know he's lying? He whispered, his unkempt hair tickling the nape of Carter's neck. Like hell I'd know. Just shut up and listen, Carter hissed through gritted teeth. He outstretched his arms and grasped Jimmy's ear, twisting it harshly. Get your head out of my ass, Jimmy. The boy widened his eyes, quietly gasping. Shit was all he could think. I'm not Mr. Stevenson, he pointlessly defended himself, chuckling nervously. He blinked his eyes rapidly, although his sight had not adjusted to the darkness yet, despite the fact they've been talking for at least 10 minutes. Mr. Stevenson sighed, and the boy's head was flooded with so many paranoid thoughts that he didn't have time to observe his actions. Time was slipping out of his grasp and his gut warned him that this was going to be either dangerous or inconsequential. He swiftly glimpsed behind him, wondering if now was a good time for his friends to initiate their job. No, not unless it's life-threatening, like Jimmy said, the boy told himself. Don't lie to me, boy, Mr. Stevenson said in a flat tone. If his voice were raised, the boy would immediately recoil and call out the code word. The boy hadn't noticed it until now, but his voice was strangely bland throughout this conversation, as if he was forcing human emotions. He gulped as the pace of his heart quickened. How did you know I was lying about it happening to me? The boy managed to ask after a while of confused staring. Mr. Stevenson chuckled. The laugh shot out of him like a newly sprung leak, except that it was bitter. Mr. Stevenson leaned back in his chair and widened his mouth, so that the boy could see the dark hole within, and then began laughing uproariously. It was hard to describe the emotions in that chuckle, but the boy could tell it was something to be afraid of. After a moment, Mr. Stevenson returned his gaze towards the boy, a Cheshire grin plastered on his face. It was at that moment the boy could see his sinister green eyes, glowing in the darkness. The paranormal activity is occurring to your friends, is it not? Mr. Stevenson said, smirking knowingly. The boy widened his eyes and quietly gasped. He forced himself to stay nonchalant about the conversation, and continue digging deeper. It's not true. It's not true. It's not true. Why, yes it is. Did one of them happen to inform you? The boy asked, knowing the answer. None of this was going according to Jimmy's plan, so he had to trust his gut and lunge forward while blinking back the tears. It's not true. It's not true. It's not true. No, boy. I knew myself, Mr. Stevenson replied. The boy rubbed his eyes because for some reason his teacher's green orbs were intensely bright. Although it was fortunate that there was some light, so he could observe the sudden glint of malice in his expression. It's not true. It's not true. It's not true. The boy bit his lip and resisted the urge to rub the temples of his forehead. His head was aching but his hands had a tremor, and he wanted to appear unfazed. He couldn't allow Mr. Stevenson to read him, or else the entire plan leading up to this moment would go to waste. Who? Tell me who you know is going through this, the boy questioned, testing his teacher. It's not true. It's not true. It's not true. Mr. Stevenson's lips cracked into a wide grin. Carter, Jessica, Olivia, Josh, Ronald, and Barbara. How did you know? The boy asked, gulping. He bore the facial expression of someone walking through a maze. Knowing that a scarecrow was going to jump out and surprise him from behind the bushes, he just didn't know when and where. He clenched his eyes tightly, bracing himself for the impact. I know because I'm the one who marked them. There was a suspended silence in the detention closet, which placed them on the edge. Even the sound of Jessica gnawing at her nails halted at those words. Carter suddenly wished she would continue chewing despite how annoying it was, just so his ears could hear something. His mind was swirling and his face had been washed blank as if his brain cogs couldn't turn fast enough to take in the information with his straining ears. He was right. Jimmy muttered as they all exchanged bewildered glances. What are we going to do now? Olivia frenziedly asked, her hand covering her hanging mouth. Jimmy? She asked, looking at the anxious boy. I have no idea, Jimmy said, his hands on his head. He walked towards the door and pressed his ear against it. Give me some time. Let's hear if he says anything else that could be useful, he said, in a desperate and scared tone. Ronald groaned as he crossed his arms. Damn it. Our plan went to waste. Ronald slunk meekly against the wall, his brows furrowed with disdain. Josh nodded in agreement and said the same thing but harsher. Your plan was shit, Jimmy. Like usual, he grunted, lightly punching the boy in the ribs. He admitted it, Barbara pointed out, her eyes wide with horror. So he was the one who did all that to us. Jessica wiped the tears that were dripping down her face, the realization of this situation hitting her. What do we do, Carter? He knows we're in here. She exclaimed, exasperated. Carter felt the same way. This whole time Mr. Stevenson was the one. It would have been much easier if it turned out to be Mrs. Briggs or Coach McGurty. It would be Ian's better if it simply turned out that something was wrong with this school. However, it seemed that true betrayal always comes from someone who means so much to you. Carter turned around and stiffened himself militarily, his back pressed against the door. He forced a stern expression, recollecting himself. Although internally, his heart thumped rapidly against his chest and his insides swirled. Carter gulped and looked up into everyone's wide eyes. Wait for the call. Words left the boy. He stared into those bright emerald eyes that were burning with wickedness, and his heart fell silent. The boy couldn't will his lips to move. It was as if he was stuck underwater since time seemed to move slowly and his vision was warbled. His head was accustomed to thinking, it's not true, so his thoughts subconsciously continued repeating those words. It's not true. It's not true. It's not. The boy swallowed those words and looked straight in his deceitful teacher's eyes. It's true. My prediction from earlier was true. He was slightly relieved that the suspicions were off his shoulders, and he hoped his friends in the closet caught those words. Although there was a looming feeling hovering above the boy, telling him that there was more to this story than a simple betrayal, it still pained him nonetheless. It came as a great shock, this trickery by Mr. Stevenson. What pained him the most was that all this time, he had been lying, and of course now was the start of his truths. Those green eyes of his didn't seem as friendly as they did on the first day of school. He had thought of his teacher as an alluring person, because of his laid-back and kind personality. After getting to know him, he respected and admired Mr. Stevenson, thinking of him as a potential father figure, as someone who could help. Isn't that what being a teacher is? Mr. Stevenson, why? The boy croaked, his mind so shocked that he forgot how to speak. He gave his trust to Mr. Stevenson, but it seemed he decided that the boy and his friends were not worth keeping that trust for. He realized that this whole time, their teacher felt nothing for them, and dismissed their emotions as irrelevant. It gave the boy a sickening feeling of despair. Should I call them? Is this the right time? The boy shook his head that was muddled with confusing thoughts and questions. No, not yet, he told himself as silent tears dripped down his eyes and rolled off his cheeks. He chose to think optimistically, hoping that this situation would end with the best outcome possible, just like Jimmy said it should. Although that hope was nothing but a tiny candlelight in the middle of the endless blackness in his mind. Mr. Stevenson sat calmly at his desk, his hands folded neatly. He seemed happy that his act was finally over, judging from the smug expression he wore. It was unbelievable how quickly his attitude changed. It took the boy a while to process this sudden shift, and it still didn't sit well with him. Did you think you could hide your friend so that you can act as the hero and risk yourself while confronting me? He began, sneering. What do you mean? The boy questioned, swallowing the lump in his throat. How did he know? I saw you glancing over your shoulder at the closet. Plus they're marked. I know where they are every second of the day. It's like I'm tracking them. Mr. Stevenson leaned back in his chair and paused to chuckle. No engineer has created tracking devices like that yet. How? The boy stuttered, his mind devoid of all thought. The boy was too shocked to even fight back or say more. Why, I have paranormal powers, boy. I can do and see anything, he vaguely said. Mr. Stevenson leaned forward, a dark glint in his eyes. I know all about your after-school meetings that take place in my classroom. I hear everything you discuss. From your stupid arguments to your idiotic theories and predictions. The boy simply stared at him with distraught in his eyes, unable to say anything. His eyes began to brim with burning tears, rendering him unable to convey the level of betrayal that was searing through his quivering body. He hopelessly sat in his chair and allowed Mr. Stevenson to jest further. Oh, how could I forget that incredibly awful test you did against the school? He added, sniggering with a jeer. Did you folks truly believe that you would be able to get answers by forcing the paranormal activity on yourselves and assuming the answer based on the result? How foolish. I'm not an idiot, boy. I purposely made sure the results were confusing. The boy bit his lip and his eyes widened, unable to speak. They had assumed if more than one person experienced the thing, it's not the school. The puzzling conclusion they arrived at was that paranormal activity can only occur to one of them at a time, which meant that the one being the school was highly possible. That was before their trip to the library, but the information was useful nonetheless. Or so they thought. As he recalled this, he realized Jimmy would pound him later for not investigating further, so he decided to strengthen his weakened body and go for it. He had many questions circling his mind and decided to start with the biggest one of all. Mr. Stevenson. Why did you mark them? What do you want from us? Mr. Stevenson snorted and dismissed his question. He suddenly grabbed the wrist of the boy's right hand and stood up. A gasp escaped his mouth as he clenched his lips shut, refusing to be dragged upwards alongside him. He continued to sit stubbornly in his seat, ignoring the painful grip. I marked them all and had fun tormenting them, but what irritated me the most was the fact that you were supposed to be marked this entire time. I chased you for many days, boy. Finally, I was able to mark you today by forcing it. But you don't remember that, as I erased your memories. Although you're marked and can see the paranormal activity now, you're still different from the rest of them, Mr. Stevenson said, looming over the boy like a skeletal tree in the middle of an eerie forest. The boy simply stared up at him, his right arm losing all its blood from being raised in the air. His legs were shaky and could not support his body, yet he abruptly stood up anyway. The excruciating pain of Mr. Stevenson's coarse hands wrapped around his wrist rushed through his body like an igniting fire. He suddenly grew cold and his hurt feelings halted. His muddled mind turned clear, and he was able to see that there was nothing valuable for him mourning Mr. Stevenson's betrayal. Everything slowed down, the confusion and disbelief washed away, leaving only bewilderment as to why he didn't see this sooner. Gradually, the pain faded away as sweat trickled down his face. His hand was still tightly gripped around his wrist, twisting it, but the boy had gotten used to it after a while. This was nothing compared to the pain he experienced his entire life. For once, he knew exactly what to do next. Do you know why, boy, I was unable to mark you until now? Mr. Stevenson asked, with the dark and intimidating voice his father would use. The boy silently shook his head. forcing a determined expression as his heart hammered against his tense chest. "Because you are a 1946. The boy urgently screamed. The boy knew what he was, but he swore to himself long ago that no one could find out. "That's our cue," he heard Carter yell in response. The door of the closet suddenly burst open, and emerging from it were his best friends. Carter came rushing out, his silky silver hair billowing in the rush of air. Jessica and Barbara tumbled out after, their faces contoured with concern and anguish. Olivia, Ronald, Josh, and Jimmy quickly pushed past each other to see for themselves whether the words they were hearing ring true. The boy turned around as tears of relief streamed down his cheeks. The tight grip of Mr. Stevenson felt like it was stopping his blood flow, but seeing his friends soothed him. He let out a slow, controlled breath and attempted to loosen his tensed body. "Carter," the boy desperately called, glad to see his face again. All 7 of them rushed towards the boy, preparing to pull him away from Mr. Stevenson's grip, as it was their part of the plan if things ended up this way. However, they stopped dead in their tracks when Mr. Stevenson stared at them with an amused look. Tension suddenly flooded the air, thicker than it was with just the boy and the man. It filled the gaps in their broken hearts, despite it being an inefficient way to heal. "Mr. Stevenson, it was you this whole time?" Carter asked, clenching his fists as fury raged in his eyes. It was difficult to believe what they were saying was true from within the closet, because the boy knew that Carter trusts his eyes more than his ears. However, the scene in front of him connected the puzzle pieces perfectly. If one chose not to believe the sight in front of them, they would have to be disconnected from reality. "Mr. Stevenson," Josh mumbled, his eyes wide with anguish. His voice was quiet and pained, as if he couldn't compute the fact that the man in front of him was the same man he enjoyed playing basketball with a couple of days ago. Even as early as this morning during homeroom, they had been joking around with their teacher. The boy remembered thinking he would cherish those happy memories. It was one of the few where the group wouldn't be in serious distress about discussing the paranormal activity, and were simply enjoying their youth with their favorite teacher. The happy moments they had settled in his synapses for a moment. Although it did not reset his mood or bring him joy, it caused a whirlwind of emotions to swirl through him. Sorrow, longing, anguish, anger, and pure hatred. The memories of these past days were like a teddy bear fashioned from glass shards. As the tighter one clings to it, the deeper it will cut. "You jerk!" Olivia yelled, hoisting her pink purse in the air. She was prepared to slam his damned face with it, but Ronald wrapped his arms around her waist and pulled her back, saying that it was too dangerous. The children truly did not know what that man was capable of, and that fact caused them to fear someone that used to bring them comfort. It was worse than the uncanny and inscrutable paranormal activity they would experience. This wasn't a demon or monster that they could run away from. This was their teacher, a man. There was no greater fear they could experience than that of a man they had a bond with. Hello, my leadership club students. The future leaders of Willesden, huh? Mr. Stevenson laughed bitterly and shook his head. "There will be no future for you marked folks. I will succeed in my mission, and to do that I must kill you all." Carter scowled at Mr. Stevenson. "Let go of him right now." Their teacher manically laughed. Sometimes I forgot you folks are just children," he said, twisting the boy's wrists. The boy let out a whimper of pain as his bone cracked. "Well, what do you say? Are you surprised?" he questioned in a sardonic tone that infuriated the children. Ronald growled with scorn, glaring at Mr. Stevenson. "You damn traitor. You were the one who did that to us. Do you not have any human decency?" Mr. Stevenson grinned like a Cheshire cat. "I am not human." "What do you mean?" "You better tell us everything, jerk," Jimmy yelled, rushing forward so he could see Mr. Stevenson with his stunted vision. Mr. Stevenson craned his neck and grinned at Jimmy, ignoring his question. "I must admit, some of your theories were spot on, Jimmy. My paranormal powers do target the fears of the people I have marked on the first day of school. It manifests a different form for each marked person to reflect their deepest fear. It makes for an amusing Monday night if I do say so myself." Olivia glared at him, and it looked like she was about to pounce him with her pink heels. "That is so cruel," was all she could counter with. It was difficult for the students to convey their mixed emotions with words. There were no sentences that could weave their emotions perfectly, despite the many attempts. Mr. Stevenson, we played basketball together. Josh cried, and the boy widened his eyes, having never seen Josh this emotionally wrecked before. I don't believe you, Mr. Stevenson, Barbara uselessly whispered, her teeth chattering with fear. She hid behind Jessica, for fear that Mr. Stevenson would suddenly make the paranormal activity happen to her. Even if he did, there wasn't much these defenseless kids could do. Their strong points were strategizing and investigating, not battling. Mr. Stevenson titled his head, his hand still tightly clutched around the boy's wrist. Oh, would you like me to prove it then? He taunted, his mouth curving into a sinister and sadistic grin. Before any of them could respond, Mr. Stevenson raised his free arm and snapped his fingers. Dark mist poured from his right palm and spilled onto the ground, like a shower of ominously delicate petals raining down. It was a slow process, but it still caused the group to recoil with fear at the shocking magic they were witnessing. The boy shuddered since he was the closest to the inky pool. Mr. Stevenson's hands turned frigid, and it sent icy chills up his back. Slowly, the mist rose upwards and molded itself into a black shadow. It was a humanoid shadow that most of them were all too familiar with. Carter and Olivia widened their eyes with shock, while Mr. Stevenson chuckled with amusement. Why does he think this is a funny game? The boy gritted his teeth with rage, trying to loosen the hands that were curled around his wrist, but it was no use. Next to the shadow, another figure rose. A little girl. Her face was dripping in a way that made the boy flinch, and her liquidy limbs swayed back and forth. The little girl's abnormal pupils innocently blinked up at Jessica. Her pink lipstick melted down her chin, amongst her coarse frowning lips. Her frizzy blonde hair swished wildly with every spin of her head as she trotted towards Jessica, who screamed with horror. More shapes and figures emerged from the pool, lining up beside one another and staring ominously at the students. A monstrous spider crashed the ceiling above them, hissing at Barbara, a dark-haired lady whose limbs were flailing maniacally as she ran towards Josh. And surprisingly, a ghost version of Josh, that creepily crawled towards Ronald. His friends all cried in unison at the familiar creatures that blinked evilly at them. Josh stumbled over a couple of desks and chairs, in an attempt to back away from the crazy lady that chanted the word scholarship repeatedly. A loud piercing scream escaped from Jessica's mouth as she tried kicking the little zombie girl away, who only blinked up at her with a mirror in one hand and pink lipstick in the other. Barbara dove under a desk as the enormous spider patted its way towards her, hissing at her to finish its homework. Ronald didn't have time to explain to Josh as to why a ghost version of him appeared, as that ghost clung onto his leg and wouldn't let go, like the haunting childhood memories of a lost friend. The boy watched with horror as Olivia fought against the shadow that was strangling her, and touching her in places that caused disgust to build up in him. Carter stood amid the chaos, enveloped by the darkness, which covered his view of the boy. The boy slowly realized that he was finally able to see all of his friend's fears, manifested in these abnormal creatures. A choked cry forced itself up his throat and he shook his right arm intensely, only to be met with a malicious glare from Mr. Stevenson. The boy desperately wanted to embrace his friends and do something, but he couldn't. He just couldn't. This man is terrorizing my friends. I can't see what y'all are seeing. Jimmy exclaimed, exasperated. Ronald rushed forward and explained what was happening in Jimmy's ears, both of them shaking anxiously. He suddenly jumped up with surprise. I thought you were only able to produce paranormal activity one at a time. Jimmy cried with utter shock. I purposely made your test results misleading, Mr. Stevenson smugly said, proud of himself. I hear and see everything, folks. Fear shadowed his friends' faces as they stared at their fears with shock. The boy grunted and clawed Mr. Stevenson's hands with his free arm, but his hand was attached to his like glue. Mr. Stevenson jerked the boy upwards, his legs slamming into the sharp sides of his desk. I am not going to let you go, Mr. Stevenson hissed to the boy that was under his wrath. Jimmy was right when he said that you have some sort of ability to get rid of the paranormal activity. Everyone in the classroom stared at their teacher with shock at that comment, as the shadows and demons slowly disintegrated on the spot. The room was suddenly silent as they realized Mr. Stevenson wasn't going to attack just yet. Barbara halted her weeping and they all exchanged suspended glances. "Oh, you didn't know, Mr. Stevenson teased, looking up at the group with a smug expression. He walked around his desk and grinned, his hands still curled around the boy like a leash. "I was shocked too when I found out. When this boy," he paused to jerk his arm upwards. The boy wailed as tears streamed down his cheeks, dripping from his chin. "Touches you, the paranormal activity will disappear instantly. Why does he possess these strange powers, you ask? Would you children like me to tell you?" He sneered tauntingly. He twisted the boy's hand and cracked it, causing the boy to scream with an agony that was deeper than the ocean's currents. As much as they wanted to know, they couldn't stand Mr. Stevenson tormenting their friend like this. "Get away from him!" Jessica yelled at Mr. Stevenson, stomping forward to retrieve the suffering boy. Before she could wrap her hands around his waist and pull him back, she was struck down. "Jessica!" the boy cried, his free hand outstretched in hopes that he could save her. Unfortunately, due to his current situation, he was helpless. Mr. Stevenson had instantly lifted his right hand and snapped his fingers directly at Jessica. Black shards suddenly appeared at his command, and the students screamed with petrifying fear. The obsidian shards were about the size of the desks scattered in the classroom, dancing and shooting in the air like bullets. The shards looked like they could pierce through human flesh with ease, which caused everyone to immediately crouch and cover their heads. Thankfully, Jessica dodged in time and Carter caught her before the shard that whizzed past her could do any serious damage. It clanged against the wall and exploded, causing Jessica to gasp with surprise. The students all gaped at Mr. Stevenson with wide eyes, their hearts racing. It seemed he truly wanted to kill them, and that realization struck them with so much impact that Barbara resumed crying. "You children have no chance of winning against me, for I am 200 years old, Mr. Stevenson boldly declared, splaying his right palm in the air. He teased the students by wiggling his fingers, rendering them uncertain about his next attack. Every time he playfully smacked his hand forward, the shivering students would flinch and recoil. "I was born on September 3, 1746. That was well before your time," he added, chuckling. The group exchanged shocked glances, but by now they wouldn't be surprised if that was true. Everyone was more pained about the fact that their teacher was the one causing their turmoil for the past few weeks. Olivia was the most furious, as her rage was written on her face and not masked with sadness like the others. The boy assumed her paranormal experience traumatized her a lot, because he had noticed a recent shift in her behavior. Olivia leaped forward, with her pink purse hoisted in the air again. "I don't care if you're older than my grandfather. It was because of your stupid paranormal doings that I had to suffer for days." She screamed but was interrupted when Mr. Stevenson flicked his hands again. He aimed directly at Olivia, the black shards spawning out of thin air again and obeying his every command. This time he used two hands, so he forgot about the boy that was released from his grip. The boy quickly ran away and slammed into Carter, who grabbed him and pulled him close. The feeling of Mr. Stevenson's ice-cold hands wrapped around his wrist lingered and left red blisters, so it soothed him when Carter gently rubbed his wrist. Jessica let out a whimper and hugged the boy too, who broke into tears alongside her. "I'm never going to let you go again," Carter whispered in his ear, hugging him from behind. Suddenly, a white blinding light shone around the room. The students peered at Mr. Stevenson, who had all his attention focused on this next attack. He seemed eager to get rid of Olivia, as a greedy grin was plastered on his face. "You're making my job easier, so thank you for that, Olivia. If anyone else would like to step forward, I will gladly kill you," he threatened nonchalantly. Numerous black shards propelled towards Olivia and she froze in her tracks. Her paralyzed body had no idea what to do because the biggest shard was hauling towards her at a fast rate. It was too fast so she couldn't think, and her brain only managed to register the fact that she was going to die. The boy instinctively prepared to lunge forward and save his friend, when Josh did that for him. He was much closer to Olivia and ran towards her with lightning speed, as if protecting her was an animal instinct of his. "Olivia!" Josh desperately shouted. Without a moment's hesitation, he grabbed her by the waist and pushed her to the ground, shielding her with his body. The shard skimmed past Josh's shoulder, which caused a bloody tear to form in his skin, but it wasn't as big as the impact it had on the wall behind them, Or rather the person. Josh. Your shoulder. Olivia exclaimed, panting heavily and blinking her eyes as her brain registered what just happened. She clasped her hands around Josh's blood-splattered cheek and peered at him with concern. Josh nodded, grimacing at the moderate pain that seared through his shoulder.
Yeah.
I'm just glad you're okay, Olivia. He grumbled, pressing his forehead against hers. He applied pressure by pressing his hands against his shoulder while scarlet blood cascaded down his arm. Tears brimmed Olivia's eyes as she gazed into Josh's emerald eyes. Why, you saved me. She hiccuped, her heart skipping a beat. Suddenly, an explosion could be heard from next to them, where the shard landed. Yeah. They stared at each other for a suspended minute, but not with love or gratitude. Their eyes were wide with alarm, and so were the others who were scattered around the room. Carter stood with his arms around the boy, massaging his wrist, but he suddenly stopped when the explosion and a tiny child's whimper could be heard. Jessica released her tight clutch from the boy and Barbara, her breath becoming raggedy as a dreaded assumption entered her mind. Ronald gasped from the other side of the room, his paralyzed legs unable to move. Their hearts squeezed and dropped to the floor, as a gut feeling told them something they were not expecting to hear. Josh and Olivia slowly turned around, panting with disbelief. When their eyes landed on the sight, they gasped, winded. The boy, Carter, Jessica, Barbara, and Ronald rushed towards the corner of the classroom without hesitation, praying that the voice they heard was just a stupid mistake. One can never truly feel another's pain, but that scream of Jimmy's came close. It was the kind of scream that placed every other thought on hold and rooted everyone near the same agony. His eyes were wide with horror, his mouth rigid and open, his chalky face gaunt, and his fists clenched with blanched knuckles. The scream came from deep within his soul and pierced through the glass with such ease that it made them halt for a second with pure fright. Jimmy stood with his arms and legs slightly apart as his hands shook, flapping like a dying bird. His face was contoured with extreme pain as he stared down at his belly. While he peered down, his glasses slid off his face, shattering as it fell to the floor. He stood rigid, and through his parted lips he drew tiny gasps, unable to scream further as all oxygen had been knocked out of his body. He could only muster a couple of whimpers and cries as his heart plunged to the ground. There was a wide hole in his lower stomach where the black shard obliterated. His stomach was cut so clean that they could see the wall behind him through that hole. Organs spilled out of his ripped torso in such a gruesome manner that it would make the boy recoil if Jimmy weren't his friend. The explosion of the shard was so big his blood rained on the wall behind him, dripping at the same pace as the blood from his stomach. His belly had been completely wiped out, and some bits of his flesh scattered the ground like confetti. Mr. Stevenson smiled. Oops. Everyone swarmed around Jimmy, who had fallen to his knees. They watched with pure agony as their tears dripped onto the floor, creating pools of their sorrow. He was quivering intensely and no part of his lanky body could function properly. Ronald cried and held Jimmy by his shoulders, hoping that would halt his impending death. Jimmy! Jimmy! He wailed, clutching his shoulders tightly. Am I going to die? Jimmy sputtered, gasping for air as his limbs flailed frantically. He peered at his internal organs that lay on the floor, twitching like fish on land. But I have the chess club nationals to go to tomorrow. I'm the captain. I can't just leave my team behind. I promised them we would actually get G gold this year. No. Jimmy, no. You're not going to die. The boy screamed, grabbing the sides of his face. He peered into his hazel eyes, scrutinizing the depth and life that was within. They were stunningly gorgeous, his eyes. They were the softest honey infused with green, as if he held the entire season of spring in them. They were the perfect mixture of the brown forest floor and the gentle green flowers, a place to rest and breathe. They shone like sunlight on a polished stone under his flaky blonde hair. Although the usual creases of his geeky smile lines sagged as he was intelligent enough to realize that his friends were clinging on to hopelessness. But I don't want to die. I told my parents that I would be coming home at approximately 6 o'clock. Jimmy stammered, unable to kneel any longer. Please. I don't want to. He gasped, and his friends quickly grasped his shoulders to stop him from falling. Jimmy! Josh and Carter cried in unison, their eyes wide with horror. They tried slapping his cheek so his eyelids could stop drooping, but it was no use. His eyes were slowly rolling to the back of his head, only occasionally fluttering open. Regret dawned on them at that moment. All the pointless banter and stupid arguments they had. Oh, how they wished they could take it all back and start anew. However, despite the many sentimental apologies and Cadence crying, it would not change the fact that Jimmy was in front of them, dying. No matter how much they desperately tried to shake Jimmy, hoping that it would stop his soul from flying away, it wouldn't work. Telling themselves that this was all a dream, and what they were experiencing was not real wasn't going to change anything either. Nothing will ever stop death. Jessica hugged the upper part of Jimmy that had not been blown off and cried against his chest. You're not going anywhere, Jimmy. You helped us so much. It's because of you we learned the truth. You can't. You can't. Someone get a doctor. Olivia screamed, her palm covering her mouth as she resisted the urge to scream. She kneeled on the floor, aware of the fact that she was dipped in Jimmy's blood, but that did not disgust her. Barbara stared with absolute shock as blood drooled out of Jimmy's nose and eyes, drenching his white shirt and rolling down his suspenders. There's no doctor. She cried, falling to the ground as the weight of the situation dropped on her back. Jimmy fell to the ground. It was weird, seeing only half of Jimmy functioning while the remains of his body were scattered around the classroom, and it caused grief to wash over the boy. Carter swiftly rolled him so that he was on his back, pumping his chest with his fists in an attempt to revive him. It only worked for a hasty second, but that was all he needed. I guess I should say my last words, huh? Jimmy sputtered, chuckling as black filled the edges of his vision. The pain that once burned like fire in Jimmy had faded away to an icy numbness. His friends peered down at him, weeping and screaming for him not to die. How should he tell them that he already saw death standing on the sidelines, waiting for him to draw his last breath so he could collect his soul and send him wherever he needed to go? Jimmy's eyes landed on the black-haired boy, desperately running his hands through his hair, too naive for the darkness of the real world.
Jimmy, no.
You're not going to die. We'll get help, I promise. Wait here, okay? Please just hang on. The boy wailed, shaking his scrawny body. I'm sorry I ever suspected ya, Jimmy managed to say before his last breath was drawn and his fragile human heart beat for the last time. No, you don't have to apologize, Jimmy. The boy cried, but after much yelling and sobbing, they realized that he was gone. His body remained, resting on the boy's lap, but he was gone. Jimmy was gone. It was baffling, really. The way death was eager to snatch life away from humans, just like life could easily create humans. Or perhaps it was the despair and suffering of the world that took Jimmy from them. Although that rendered him to feel powerless, it made him realize how small they were in the grand scheme of life and death, and how stupid all their teasing and problems with each other were. All the boy was able to do is pray that Jimmy can leave all the pain behind and die happily. That only caused his heart to grow numb. What the hell can praying do? He's already dead. The boy angrily thought, his face scrunched with intense remorse. The boy paused, attempting to hold back the strange feelings rumbling inside him, but it was impossible. A lone tear traced down his cheek, and just like that, the floodgates opened. His chin trembled and his lower lip quivered as he gazed at the lifeless Jimmy. He gasped and panted as his breathing quickened and his heart yanked in and out of his chest with deep-rooted grief. The boy cried with more violence than any gale. He and the others didn't break quietly. Instead, every atom of his being screamed in unison, traumatized that they should exist without Jimmy. When the racking sobs passed, he cried in such a desolate way that was difficult for the others to hear. The boy had gone from gregarious to hanging by a thread, a transformation that was impossible to reverse. The boy and his friend sat staring at his hollow face for long minutes. Jimmy's once cheerful face now sunken and haunted, his mind cold and empty. Blood flowed thick and sluggish from the hole across his gut. His once childlike features were spotted with angry bruises, and death had frozen his face into a gentle frown, a final eternal lamentation to the heavens. Without Jimmy, it was deadly quiet and torturous to his soul. He suddenly missed Jimmy's chirpy attitude and his gloating of the chess club. It disgusted him that the thought of Jimmy being too weird ever crossed his mind. He was the most intelligent and joyous person the boy had ever met. The world suddenly turned into a blur, and so did all the sounds. Everything was just gone. The boy solemnly stood up, his legs shaking as rage coursed through him. He clenched his fists and grudgingly trudged towards the front of the classroom. He stared at Mr. Stevenson, a dark glimmer in his eyes and a heavy heart pounding against his chest. Mr. Stevenson had been watching from the sidelines, leaning against his desk and crossing his arms satisfactorily. Not a hint of remorse, guilt, or grief was in his expression. Just amusement.
Stupidly pure amusement.
I meant to kill you, marked folk, but I suppose cutting off the only one of you who had a brain was a smart decision, he said, shrugging and grinning with too much joy. The gang slowly followed behind him. Ronald carried Jimmy in his arms, tears staining his cheeks. Everyone wept and sniffled, as there was a void in their group now. They all lined alongside the boy, some giving Mr. Stevenson a deadly glare and others wiping tears. They hadn't expected things would turn out this way, and not even Jimmy had predicted this outcome. The best-case scenario was that they would find out the truth, figure out a solution, and not get hurt. But even that was wishful thinking. Jimmy deserved to hear the explanation from Mr. Stevenson, but he cruelly cut his life short. That enraged the boy. All blood drained from his face and his pulse quickened. Only the feelings of pure hatred and vengeance circled his brain. Carter broke the silence first, his voice wavering with anguish. Mr. Stevenson, how could you do this to your student? You're the one who taught us that a leader never hurts their comrades. Mr. Stevenson sniggered and snapped his fingers, a rotten black apple dropping from the sky and landing in his palm. He took a bite out of it and he began crunching, unfazed as if killing an innocent 16-year-old boy was something he did often. That leadership club was all part of my act, for you to trust me and suspect him, he said, nodding towards the boy. Although, I suppose that boy truly does have a part to play in this after all, Mr. Stevenson added, smirking. We should just leave. Jessica wailed, her hands covering her damp face. Let's get Jimmy to a hospital. Mr. Stevenson boisterously laughed. I locked all the doors and windows the moment I knew you folks were up to something, he sighed happily. There's no escaping Willesden, especially after school. The boy's chest heaved at that snarky comment because every time he opened his mouth, he got angrier. His body lost its strength long ago. His mind shattered and the rest of him followed suit. His fingers dug in his blistered palms and he could see the man's neck snapping in his mind. Felt good. He could feel his fists smashing into his nose, splattering red blood on the dirty gray walls. Revenge is coming, his mind hissed. The boy wasn't afraid to do absolutely anything to make sure Mr. Stevenson burned in hell, even if it meant he would have to go there himself. He would do it all just so he could pay for the damage and heartbreak he caused. He prepared to raise his fist, but the blackness approached him again. Its name was the devil, the boy recalled. The devil curled its shadowy hand around his wrist and hissed words in his ear, its icy breath chilling his soul. The boy gasped and listened to the devil. Then he repeated those same words out loud, for all to hear. The boy looked at the man and said, You're a witch, Mr. Stevenson. The man smirked, taking a huge bite from his apple, crunching wickedly. No, Utah. You're the witch. End of part 1.